1998 was a fantastic year for gaming. Not only did we get fantastic RPGs such as Baldur's Gate and Fallout 2, but other classic games of various genres such as Half-Life and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. While all of those games are fantastic in their own way, 1998 was important in another way. As with games like Metal Gear Solid, it brought the entire genre of stealth gaming into the mainstream, showing that such games could be very interesting and fun to play. One of those games, as you can assume since you clicked on the video, was Thief, the dark project, created by Looking Glass Studios, the same company who brought us games like the Ultima Underworld series. I will be playing the re-released edition called Thief Gold, which has some extra maps compared to the original version and is currently available to purchase digitally. In addition, I've installed a mod called T-Fix, which adds better compatibility with modern hardware and has optional graphical and gameplay additions that can be chosen during installation. I chose none of those, to still keep the experience as close to the original as possible, while also eliminating a bunch of bugs in the process. For me, this was absolutely necessary, since the GOG version was uncooperative and just refused to work. After the mandatory company logos, starting the game leads to an introductory video, which is very turn of the millennium. It starts with a quote from something called the Book of the Stone, condemning the act of theft in ye olde English, after which scenes of medieval people and landscapes flash past, with more strange visuals of a horned creature accompanying these more familiar scenes. The editing style is very fast and is accompanied by a moody but energetic industrial music track. This introduction explains very little, but I love it as a little time capsule of the era. And to me it acts as a nice teaser, creating this feeling of wanting to know what all of the symbols and images seen actually mean, or what they have to do with the game. After the surreal cutscene, you're thrust into the main menu, which is stylized to look like a steampunk-like device with an accompanying ambiance of machinery pumping and hissing. The key point here is, as usual, the options menu. The first tab is the control configuration menu, in which you can choose some standard settings such as whether to have inverted vertical movement of the mouse and whether free look is on. Something that is now a vestige of older game design from games which were also created to be potentially played with the keyboard only. You can also customize your key bindings, of which there are very many. Some of the standard settings may seem a little strange for someone used to the modern WASD standard, but thankfully the game not only lets you edit absolutely every control option imaginable, but you can also save and load those settings in case different players on the same machine want to use different controls. There are also some pre-made control setups which can be loaded from the menu, in case one of those is more appealing to the player than the default. The next window is the video configuration menu, where you can choose the 3D accelerator hardware currently in use and the display resolution. In the T-Fix version, the game properly supports widescreen resolutions, making the game more pleasant to play on modern monitors. There are also some basic level of detail options for visual effects, but overall the amount of things the player has control over is very limited. The audio settings menu is very similar, and the only volume sliders available are the master volume and the volume of the ambience. This is a bit of a shame, especially since the game has no subtitles and more accessibility options are always appreciated. One of the best parts of the audio is the hardware acceleration, and if you can turn on EAX, which enhances some of the audio capabilities of the game. The final window is the game menu, where you can choose how some basic gameplay features function, such as how to attach the character to ladders, whether to automatically search bodies, and so on. Once you're done with choosing the settings you want, it's time to finally start the game. In the new game menu, you can choose from 3 difficulty settings, the effects of which are not explained at all, and more importantly, whether to play through the training segment or not. If you choose to play through training, not only are you able to practice the basic controls of the game, you're also shown a cutscene introducing us to the main character you'll be playing as. After a quote from someone called a keeper, you're shown a series of vignettes with accompanying voiceovers from our main character, explaining their childhood of poverty, living in the streets of the city, doing whatever odd jobs they can to survive, until one day they noticed a hooded man who seemed to be mostly unnoticed by other people. Assuming this man was carrying something valuable, our street rat goes in for the loot, but is caught in the act. Pleading the hooded man to not call something called the Hammers, our protagonist introduces himself as Garrett. The hooded man compliments Garrett's talent with a pretty cool voice line.
To see a keeper is not an easy thing, especially one who does not wish to be seen.
The man offers Garrett a different future, something better than living on the streets, a proposition Garrett eventually decides to take, explaining it led to a very long education. But what kind of an education? Well, that is explained in the training segment. Before getting there, however, you're shown a briefing screen, where the name of the mission and the basic goals are explained. Once you've read what you need to do, it's time to actually start the training, as you find yourself in a shaded portion of a room where a teacher is giving you instructions on what to do to proceed. Your first task is to move into the training room, which can be seen as a basic tutorial on how to actually control your character by using the control settings chosen in the menu. Most of the controls are very basic, and in addition to standard movement controls, you can jump, crouch, and lean left and right and forwards. One interesting aspect of the movement is that there is a small amount of head bob and inertia, which can be seen when moving in a direction and stopping. The first training room teaches you about light and darkness, by having you move from one end of the room to the other without being seen. Failing this, you're made to retry the segment. To aid in this task, you're given a visibility gem element at the bottom of the screen. Using this gem, it's possible to accurately gauge how hidden the game calculates you to be, meaning you don't have to merely guess based on the environmental lighting of the area you're currently in. Once you've reached the instructor, you're taught how to manipulate objects in their environment, as you're told to open a door. To do so, you need to first target the door, signified by it being visibly highlighted. Once the door is highlighted, you need to press the use button and the door opens. The next room is about sound, and teaches you about how movement speed and different surfaces are important when trying to remain unnoticed. Each of the surfaces has a different sound, and you must use the sound of your own footsteps to gauge how silent you currently are, as unlike the visibility gem, you're not given a UI element to display how loud you are. This is a good moment to practice how the game applies sound to your footsteps, as most of the room is carpeted while some portions have very loud metal plates. While on the carpet, you can even run without being heard, but on the metal plates, the only way to move without making loud noises is to crouch and move very, very slowly.
I could hear that.
Try again.
While the game doesn't direct you to experiment in depth, having this kind of a safe area to do so is still a very good thing. Next, you'll find yourself in a courtyard, where the first thing you're taught is picking up items, as you're directed to take your weapons from the table. This works in a similar way as opening a door. You highlight an object and press the use button, which immediately moves the item into your inventory. Once in possession of your weapons, you're directed to practice with a bow. Using it is relatively simple. First you need to equip the weapon, after which you press and hold the attack button. This draws the bow, which has a very clear targeting element to it. A good addition since the game doesn't have a crosshair baked into the user interface. Learning how to use this targeting element is important and moderately difficult, especially since after firing your first arrow you're bound to notice one feature, as the game has projectile drop mechanics. This introduces the idea of having to not only trail your intended target due to the slow arrow movement speed, but also having to aim above your target if you intend to actually hit something. Next, you're taught how to use your sword. There are 3 major mechanics with it. The primary mechanic is a basic slash attack, which is done by clicking the attack button. From which side the attack happens from depends on which side of the target you're looking at. You can also do a stronger overhead swing by pressing and holding the attack button. Finally, you can block by pressing the block button. After practicing these moves on a dummy, you're given the opportunity to try these out with a living target who actually strikes back. Once you feel comfortable enough with the mechanics, you can merely exit the training circle, after which the game teaches you one final thing before letting you move forwards. On a table nearby are 3 items which the instructor directs you to pick up: an apple, a key, and a healing potion. To use any of these items, you first need to scroll your inventory with the appropriate buttons and then press the use button. With consumable items such as the healing potion, doing so immediately uses the item and applies its effect. With a key, pressing use while it's equipped raises it to the center of the screen, basically signifying a use mode. Doing so while a usable object such as locked door is highlighted attempts to use the item on the highlighted object. In this case, you can unlock the door to the final training area. Here you find a simple obstacle course intended to teach you some more advanced movement functions. You're directed to jump on a rope, which attaches you onto it and activates the climb mode. To climb up or down, you merely need to look in that direction and press forwards. To get off the rope, you need to jump. This allows you to climb to a higher platform where you learn about mantling, which can be done by pressing and holding the jump button. Despite it not being a part of the tutorial route, this area also allows you to practice things like swimming, in case the basic tutorial is not enough and you wish to retry things or experiment more with the advanced movement functions. Once done, you can enter the dormitory, where we learn a little bit more about Garrett. These people training you, who are called the Keepers, seem to have some kind of a plan for Garrett's future. But he has his own plans for these skills, which are demonstrated by having a valuable object highlighted right in front of you, and as you take it, the tutorial ends. I mostly like this tutorial. First of all, it's not mandatory, and you're given a very clear choice to either do it or avoid it. It's also not terribly long, and goes through some important functions of the game in a swift and easily understandable fashion. The one part that I kinda dislike is that the tutorial segment is still tightly tied to the main story, and the only way to properly learn about Garrett's upbringing, and hear the name The Keepers, is to play through the tutorial at least once. It's not that big of a deal, but does mean that the ability to skip the tutorial is somewhat mitigated by the fact that some story is still told within that segment. Next, you're led into yet another cutscene, beginning with cryptic images of robed figures in a library of sorts, and yet another quote, describing a sort of prodigal son still being observed by those he abandoned for selfish pursuits, which clearly doesn't sound like anybody we know. This leads to a series of vignettes, with Garrett's voiceover explaining the purpose of the upcoming mission. He is now living a life of a master thief, and your goal in the upcoming level is to break into a nobleman's residence, from which Garrett intends to steal a jewel-encrusted scepter that he can then sell to his informant/fence, Cutis. During the voiceover, Garrett explains some details about how to infiltrate the building and where he assumes the scepter might be hidden. I find this to be a very interesting way to introduce the missions to the player. Not only is Garrett's self-interested and kind of nihilistic voiceover absolutely fantastic, but you're also given more world building and information about the mission during these introductory cutscenes. For example, during the first one, it's made rather clear that in this universe there are distinct class hierarchies, and the noblemen seem to not treat their servants that well, considering that a substantial risk of theft is also mentioned. I absolutely love it. Once the cutscene ends, you're shown two new features, first of which is an expansion to the mission introduction screen, also shown before the tutorial. This time, however, there are more goals presented. Not only that, this is the first moment when the game actually clearly explains what the differences between the difficulty options are. The primary difference comes in the form of goals and, as such, limitations. Playing in the normal mode, you're merely told to obtain the scepter and that's it. Simple enough. If you change the difficulty to hard, more objectives appear, and now you're given a minimum amount of additional loot that you need to find, and also given a restriction in the form of a goal forbidding you from killing civilians. In the expert mode, the minimum loot requirement becomes even higher, and you're forbidden from killing anyone. After all, you're a thief, not a murderer. I really like this. Often, difficulty selection merely makes enemies more difficult to deal with, even to the extent of just having bullet sponge enemies with absolutely no other differences to speak of. In Thief, having difficulty selection tied to your mission objectives and restrictions on how you're meant to play the game, however, is fantastic. As for this video, I'm writing the script assuming the game is played on the hard difficulty, which I find to be a nicely balanced difficulty level. The second new feature is a preparation interface, where you can purchase equipment for use during your mission. You always start with a certain amount of equipment, depending on the mission, which are shown on the left side of the screen. To purchase more equipment, you need to select them from the right side of the screen from a limited selection which also changes per mission. The bottom of the screen displays what your chosen item is and how much it costs, allowing you to browse the shop before committing to a purchase, which is done from an arrow button located at the bottom of the screen. Once you've purchased something, the money is deducted from your funds, and your current purchase is moved into the middle window of the screen. While you have items in this window, a new button called Clear is lit up next to the purchase button. This can be used to completely reset the transaction in case you decide you wish to change your loadout. In the purchase screen, you can also select a purchased item and click another new button which allows you to sell the item back. The amount of money available varies depending on your performance, and the more loot you've stolen in the earlier mission adds to your available funds. This is shown quite well if you chose to skip the tutorial, as the vase you can steal at the end of the tutorial is not counted towards your total funds if you haven't played the tutorial. Granted, in the first mission it's not that big of a deal, but it's still another little thing I consider to be a negative, as it incentivizes the playing of the tutorial even on repeat playthroughs, even though the tutorial is just linear repetition. Once you've completed your shopping spree, you can start the mission, and you find yourself in the cobblestone-covered streets of the city. As you begin moving forwards, the game introduces a new and important feature: eavesdropping. Reaching the front gate triggers dialogue between a group of guards, which at this point is merely more world building, but immediately teaches the player that other characters in the world can talk to each other, and you might do well to listen to them, as you never know when they may say something important. Another thing which is demonstrated is the directional audio system of the game, which is absolutely fantastic, and I hope at least some of it comes through in the YouTube version of this video.
Couldn't pay me enough. What? You soft belly. The bears have got these new muzzles with underslung cheek spikes. Last time I was there was a real eye gouging. Nah.
This feature is extremely important in Thief, as you're meant to be a thief who melds into the shadows, remaining unseen as you complete your objectives. This means that sometimes it's not the best idea to be visible as you try to see where the enemies are. To remedy that, the directional audio of the game is surprisingly accurate, allowing you to follow the location of the enemies with sound alone. It's absolutely fantastic, especially for the time. You may not be sure where you actually want to go, since trying to fight several guards in direct lamplight doesn't necessarily seem like a good idea. So instead, you're given a map to guide you through the mission. Opening the map shows that it's not exactly accurate. The map is a crude sketch of the entire area, and your location on the map is shown merely by having a vague area highlighted, showing the player that you're somewhere in here. What the map lacks in accuracy, it makes up with notes made by Garrett before embarking on this mission, often showing likely locations with increased danger that you should avoid, places that may contain stashes of useful items or valuable loot, and so on. In this case, the map directs you towards a side entrance that is much more loosely guarded, by one drunken guard in fact, and another one who patrols the area. This set piece acts as a potential learning point for a few features. The most thief-like way to get further is to be stealthy, gauge the patrol route of the guard, and once they're not looking, sneak behind the drunken guard, steal his key, and open the door behind him, leading you to your objective. Pickpocketing works in a similar way as taking objects in the tutorial. You merely need to remain unseen by your victim, and once the item on their belt is highlighted, press the use button to swipe the item into your inventory. The other likely lesson involves a new weapon you have, the blackjack. Using the blackjack is your best means of dismissing enemies without actually killing them, and sneaking behind someone and bopping them on the head with the blackjack instantly knocks them out. This, however, means that their body is now limp on the floor, and while you can easily loot their body for items, the other guards may not take it well if they see one of their friends unconscious on the floor. To work around this minor issue, you can carry bodies and find a place to hide them. While doing so, you're very much vulnerable, as you're much more visible, and lugging around a body makes you extremely slow. I appreciate these little set pieces, which do not directly guide the player to deal with the situation in a specific way, but acts as a way to teach the difficulties and consequences of their chosen set of actions. However, if playing on the higher difficulties, knocking people out isn't entirely safe, as an unconscious person can still be killed, either on purpose or by accident. So hiding a knocked out person at the bottom of a river, for example, not the best of ideas. Once you've gained access to the well, you can jump in and reach the aqueduct of the manor you're attempting to infiltrate. As you fall into the hole, you can hear a very distinctive sound. This is how the game informs the player that the mission objectives have changed. Whether it means you've gained a new objective, completed an objective, or lost an objective, that's contextual and can easily be checked from the objectives menu. In this case, it's a sign of completing the first objective, which has now been checkmarked as completed. In my opinion, this is a pretty good way of clearly informing the player about objective status changes without the need to have an active UI element constantly showing those objectives. If you didn't explore the tutorial segment thoroughly, this is your first introduction to the swimming mechanic. In essence, swimming is very simple. You merely move as you would while walking, but looking either up or down will let you dive in that direction. Once underwater, a new UI element appears at the bottom right of the screen, representing the amount of air you have. If this bar completely disappears, you sustain some health damage, displayed as a row of shields at the bottom left of the screen, and a very small portion of your air supply is restored. This obviously means that being underwater for too long can kill you, which leads to a short death cutscene, and you're booted into a menu where you can choose to restart the mission. Since process can be lost rather easily by dying, the game has a very comprehensive save system. You can save absolutely anywhere, and you can name your saves. There's also a quick save system, allowing you to quickly create a restore point if you're about to do something reckless. Diving in the aqueduct can lead you to a side passage, which introduces two more features, first of which is the existence of non-human enemies in the form of spiders, and the second being containers. Containers act like every other object in the game. You highlight one and activate it, and if it's unlocked, you immediately obtain the items inside. There is no way to know what's inside a container before you open it, and what is in there is only shown by having your inventory icon change to whatever you just picked up, as the game has a very simple inventory system, and everything you can pick up exists in one form or another in the world itself, instead of in a separate inventory menu. Inside the manor proper, the game changes slightly, and you're in what could be called the meat of the game. The somewhat linear outdoors with wide streets and few guards that are easily seen before they can notice you are exchanged with narrow corridors with many side passages and a complete lack of information about what is ahead of you, or where each passage will lead. This is where the skills learned so far come in handy, as you need to navigate these corridors while paying attention to everything around you. Not only to avoid being caught, but also to find your objective and as much loot as you can. To help you in your quest, one of the most important feature extensions is introduced, in the form of torches. The tutorial gave a short lesson on the importance of light, but didn't go too deep into how it actually factors into the gameplay. Regardless of your purchase choices at the beginning of the mission, you're in possession of a few water arrows. These arrows can be used to douse the torches, allowing you to create more darkness. This is a very clever way to add a way for the player to make things a little bit easier, as being in complete darkness basically means you're invisible to most enemies. But the means with which you create this new darkness is limited, and it's impossible to douse every single source of light you find. Not only that, some light sources cannot be doused at all, and the game does a pretty good job at distinguishing them visually to ensure the player is not confused about which light sources can be doused and which cannot. While the lighting in many ways is pretty good, and the interactive nature of it is not only amazing, but also important to the gameplay, there are instances where it clearly shows its age and the limitations of the engine. As you wander through the manor's corridors, you're bound to end up in situations where one side of a doorway will be lit and the other one will be dark. By opening the door between these two very distinct lightings, you can see how the lighting does not propagate, and opening the door does not change the lighting of the dark portion. Being a game from the late 90s, I wouldn't expect this to happen, as dynamic lighting was anything but common, but the lack of it in a game like Thief is still very much noticeable and an interesting way to see the limitations of the engine. Playing with a door like this can also show another more egregious limitation, which also gives the player an advantage, as the enemy AI doesn't react to the status or the sound of doors. As such, you can just open and close a door in front of a patrolling enemy and they will not react in any way whatsoever, as long as you remain in the shadows. This kind of door play also demonstrates one great feature of the audio system, as doors very effectively muffle sounds. Exploring the first floor of the manor can also show how vague the map really is, as the complex corridors of the level are not marked onto the map in any way whatsoever, nor do they fill automatically as you explore more of the level. This can be either a good or a bad thing, depending on the player's mentality. On one hand, I understand the desire to have a more comprehensive map available, which would help with not getting lost and actually being able to find what you're looking for. Personally though, when it comes to games like this, I actually like the limited maps. To To me, it adds to the immersion, and instead of following the map, you're forced to pay attention to the world instead, and keep an eye on the details of the area to navigate your way through these unfamiliar and hostile territories. The rest of the first level requires you to take advantage of everything you've learned in the tutorial while going through set pieces with a relatively small amount of defenses, until finally you reach your target and get your hands on the elusive silver scepter. In the hard difficulty, this is not the end of the mission, however, and you still need to find your way out of the mansion, which can be relatively simple if you've been taking out the guards as you've been exploring the building. Once you reach the streets, the mission ends, and you're treated to a fanfare signifying the completion of a level. At the end of each mission, you're shown the objective screen, where you can evaluate your progress and see more accurate statistics on your performance, including how much treasure you didn't find. These stats can be used as an incentive to potentially retry the mission, and perhaps find even more things to steal, some of which are not the easiest to see. The first mission of Thief is a very good way to get the player accustomed to the basic controls and features, giving them a relatively safe environment to explore, where even a small failure doesn't necessarily mean you're completely screwed, since there are barely any defenses within the mansion and the amount of guards is relatively small. This allows the player to experiment and learn by doing, while still having a high probability of success even on a first playthrough. Having examined the end of mission statistics, you're next shown another cutscene, once more beginning with cryptic imagery, this time of machinery and a hammer, and a quote depicting the tenets of the Hammerites, a religious order that worships the builder, who clearly have an animosity towards liars and thieves. This time, Garrett explains how his fence has been arrested by these Hammerites and has been taken to a well-guarded prison. This is not an optimal situation, since good fences are hard to come by, so Garrett decides to infiltrate this prison and free his valuable ally. The prison has been constructed over an old mine, the bottom levels of which are flooded and have now been completely abandoned, making them an ideal way to break into the prison above. In the preparation screen, you're once more given a set of default equipment, and the loot acquired in the previous mission is your entire pool of usable money. This is one of the more negative aspects of the game, as you can't really save money or equipment to use later, and every mission is basically its own closed ecosystem. For this mission, the game introduces a few new pieces of equipment, the usefulness of which should be very clear after the introductory mission. The first of these is a new arrow type, called Moss Arrow. These arrows can be used to cover a loud surface with a layer of soft moss, which basically acts in a similar way as carpeted surfaces, making your footsteps almost inaudible. Something that would have been very useful in the final room of the first mission with very loud tiled floors. You're also given an option to buy speed potions, which do exactly what it says on the label, giving you a great way to make an escape if you ever feel the need to do so. This is also where you're introduced to the concept of hints in the form of 2 scrolls. Buying these scrolls allows you to read them when the mission begins, and each of them gives some kind of a hint regarding either your main quest or an optional secret hidden within the level. Obviously, this system is extremely easy to exploit, and there is nothing to prevent the player from purchasing the hints, reading them, and then beginning the mission again while using the money on something more useful. The second mission begins outside the flooded mine, and as you enter the mines, the game takes a bit of a turn. This mission might be the most controversial mission of the game, and according to some reviews, the first one which turned people off the game. And I can kinda see why. The first mission showed the player a world which is clearly inspired by a rather standard medieval European aesthetic. Cobblestone streets, buildings made of wood and stone, guards patrolling the street armed with swords, with some more steampunk-like features like electric lighting and automated gates. Then you, as a thief, break into a nobleman's residence to steal a valuable item, and the same aesthetic continues. You see opulence and private guards, once more in a very standard medieval European aesthetic. This primes the player on what to expect, and that is to play as a thief stealing from the rich in a slightly steampunk-inspired medieval world. The second mission doesn't exactly throw this entirely out of the window, but it adds layers without much warning, which can be very off-putting for someone not already aware of what they should expect. This is because very early on, you're introduced to the supernatural aspects of the world in the form of zombies. These zombies cannot be killed by regular means, and the only way at this point to completely dispatch them is to find a dilapidated cathedral with a font of holy water, which can be used to bless your water arrows, making them deadly to supernatural entities. This turn really comes out of nowhere, and is a massive change in not only tone, but in gameplay as well, forcing the player to mostly just run and be fast on their feet, compared to the first mission where taking it slow was shown to be one of the most effective ways of reaching your goal. While I personally don't mind this mission, and I do appreciate the more supernatural aspects of the world of Thief, I feel like the game did not do a good job at properly introducing these aspects before thrusting the player right in the middle of them. There should have been some build-up to the introduction of supernatural elements, and where the game really fails is in teaching the player how to properly react to this aspect of the world. Based on everything learned in the first mission, it's very likely the player will try to stealth their way through the hordes of the undead, which can sometimes be moderately difficult. The zombies also cannot be knocked out, and the only way to deal with the enemies at this point is, as mentioned before, using holy water, which the game only hints at if you purchase one of the hints in the preparation menu. This is not a good way to introduce these enemies to the player, and it's more than likely that they will end up just running away from the enemies, which is one of the correct ways to deal with the situation, as the zombies are slow, while also feeling like they're playing the game wrong. I'm sure this segment was intended to be that introduction to the undead, and to teach the player they can just escape from them while having a way to actually kill the zombies as a secret they can find, but I don't think it was done particularly well. In my opinion, Garrett should have vocalized this knowledge about the undead, and been more clear about how avoiding the zombies is a proper way to deal with the situation. This isn't an unreasonable thing to expect either, since later in the same level, Garrett does exactly that, but for something the player could have learned during the tutorial.
Clanky metal grating. I better tread softly.
The second part of the mission takes place within the Hammerite compound and mostly follows the pattern of the first mission with human guards and narrow corridors. There are some notable expansions of the stealth formula, however, as now the pathways you're intended to take are more linear and the amount of guards is higher. Some of the guards are located inside small guard rooms, most of which are very difficult to sneak in. This is why you've been supplied with noisemaker arrows, which allow you to direct the guards' attention elsewhere and lure stationary guards away from their posts and either sneak past them or take them out. You can also use any throwable environmental objects to do the same thing, which is a great way with which Thief encourages emergent gameplay. Since this is a prison, there are also alarm systems the guards can activate. These are regional and merely alert the guards in the area the alarm was activated in, and don't call every guard off the map or spawn more enemies. Eventually you'll find your fence, whose health has degraded significantly, and as he is about to draw his final breath, he informs you of a scroll stored in the evidence locker of the Hammerites that reveals the location of a valuable horn. With your primary goal now changed, you climb to the highest floors of the compound, into the inner sanctum of the Hammerites, where the visual design of the level changes once more, and you can potentially engage with a completely new enemy type, as one of the Hammerite priests is adept in the magical arts. Fighting this enemy can potentially also lead to discovering a really cheap way of dealing with alerted enemies.
Thy arm must be stronger to touch me. My armor is proof against the likes of thee. Thinkest thou that harmed me? My armor is proof against the likes of thee. Thinkest thou that harmed me? Comes, my armor is proof against the likes of thee.
If you've managed to take any damage during your adventure so far, reaching the mess hall of the Hammerites has Garrett comment on whether he has time for a snack. This is actually a hint, as eating food is one of the ways you can replenish health. As you loot the evidence locker and find the scroll containing information on the valuable horn, you may also find a secret passage, if you decide to randomly strike your sword at objects. What the game doesn't explain particularly well is that you can cut down tapestries, and sometimes useful things, such as route to escape this compound, are hidden behind them. This is a great example of the variety of solutions that the game often has, but is somewhat bad at telegraphing their existence. Escaping the prison, you're once more greeted with a triumphant fanfare, and you can enjoy the next mission briefing cutscene. The note you found was about an object called the Horn of Cutis, located within the Boneyards, a massive burial ground beneath the city. The note also describes a potential buyer for the horn, so as your fence is now dead and your rent is due, you decide to brave the haunted catacombs so you can appropriate this valuable object. This mission briefing also highlights exactly what I was criticizing about the second mission. Once more you're about to enter haunted corridors, but this time Garrett's voiceover actually acknowledges how you should prepare.
Felix, always helpful, also said that the catacombs are supposed to be haunted. I think I'll go make some inquiries about where a heretic like me can get some holy water. Always go prepared.
This should have been in the second mission. Either that or the second mission shouldn't have had undead in it at all. If the game would have started with 2 somewhat regular stealth missions, followed by one where the mission briefing telegraphs the existence of the undead, and also the means with which they should be dispatched, that would have been so much better than what is currently in the game. Sure, it's not a massive negative, but just an example of how things, in my opinion, could have been done even better. Since the undead were introduced earlier, the primary feature introduced during your search for the Horn of Cutis is traps, of which there are many in the catacombs. Not only are there automatically triggered traps, but also pressure plates, which can be triggered by your body weight or with enough weight from other sources. The traps and the undead make the mission feel slightly Indiana Jones inspired, as you have to use rope arrows and solve puzzles to acquire the valuable treasures within without being crushed or blown up by the various traps littered around the level. This mission also introduces a new type of enemy, a beast called Barrick. These hulking monsters live in the underground caverns and are very much hostile to any living or unliving being. Having found the horn, you make your escape happy in the knowledge that you can afford your rent, which in this day and age seems to be one of the most unrealistic aspects of the story. After 2 missions focusing on the more supernatural aspects of the world, the next mission brings the themes back into the natural realm, as Garrett explains more about how the thieving underworld works, and how he fits into the picture. In the world of Thief, illegal activities are run by guilds that license professionals to work in their field. These guilds also assign jobs to these professionals and take a cut from the profits. Garrett, on the other hand, is an independent, refusing to work for these guilds, and as such is a kind of pariah, with very few people willing to work for him. Fortunately for Garrett, there are still some people willing to act as a fence and sell tools useful for his profession, even to someone like him. The mission begins at the shop of one of these people, and is also a pretty good way to explain why the game design sometimes works against how the story was written. After the end of the previous mission, Garrett feels pleased about his success and is preparing for a more relaxing job of breaking into a Hammerite cathedral for some easy money. For this, you're also given one objective with no special loot to steal and merely a set amount of gold you need to find. On the surface, this may seem like a nice change of pace. There's been 2 missions of running from the undead, and now you get to go back to the more usual thievery of the first mission. Except the objectives window also gives you the name of the mission, which is Assassins. This little detail pretty much immediately spoils the fact that something will happen during the mission that will completely change the objectives, and it's a bit of a shame, since what happens next isn't as much of a surprise as it could have been, when an arrow flies through the shop window, killing your fence. The assassins believe they've killed you, and now your objectives have changed, tasking you to follow these assassins to their destination, hoping to find out who is behind this attempt on your life. At the end of the long trail, you find out the culprit is a man called Ramirez, one of the heads of the guilds handling thievery in the city, and as revenge, you'll hit him where it hurts the most: his wallet. Now the more basic mission begins, and the rest of the level is very much reminiscent of the first mission, where you need to break into an opulent manor and appropriate as much loot as you can. This main part of the mission does introduce one more feature: lockpicking. In your inventory there are now 2 lockpicks. To use them on a lock, you need to select one of the picks and hold the use button while the locked object is highlighted. If the pick is wrong or the lock can't be picked, you hear a very distinctive clanking sound and nothing happens. If the pick is correct, a lock-picking sound begins to play and the handle of the lock begins to jiggle and slowly turn towards the open position. Sometimes using one pick is not enough, and you have to swap to the other pick in the middle of the lock-picking attempt. Once the lockpicking is finished, you hear a satisfying unlocking sound and the object automatically opens. I love this system. There is no minigame which takes your entire attention and becomes repetitive and boring quickly, but the lockpicking still manages to be somewhat tense and engaging. You have to look at the thing you're unlocking, and having to be very close to the object you're picking puts you in a vulnerable position. But you can also disengage immediately and try to slip into the shadows if you hear a guard coming while you're picking a lock. The tension is increased by how you might have to swap the lockpick, so it's possible to try and be fast with the picking, but be thwarted by the more complex lock needing multiple picking attempts. This to me is a much better way to include lockpicking than any minigame can ever be. Here is also where you should at the latest be introduced to some more aggressive tools at your disposal. Stealth is not Garrett's only means of survival, and sometimes more direct means are useful. For this, you're given flash bombs and mines. Flash bombs do as advertised. As you use them, they are thrown and immediately blow up on impact in a flash of blinding light, which also affects you. During this time, it's possible to either make your escape or use the short period where the enemy is disoriented to strike them with a blackjack and render them unconscious. Mines, on the other hand, are inherently deadly, and throwing them causes the mine to bounce and slide for a moment before coming to a halt. Once the mine is stopped, a short timer can be heard, which primes the mine. A primed mine acts as a trap, and once anything steps on it, a fireball is shot from the mine, causing damage to anything caught within the blast radius. The next mission is the first one added in the gold version re-release of Thief, and is honestly not the best. In many ways, the Thief's Guild mission follows most of the lessons learned thus far, but just stretches it along maze-like sewers and a bunch of backtracking. What the mission primarily does is give some more world building about the guilds, and how even within those guilds, there is infighting, and perhaps explains even more why Garrett decides to stay independent. After this level, you're finally back in the main story, as Garrett is approached by a woman called Victoria, voiced by someone pretty familiar.
Garrett, it's Victoria. I trust you made it back alive.
She tells of a magical sword kept safe deep within a newly built mansion of a wealthy merchant, Constantine. The mansion is very well protected, and you're promised a hefty compensation for your efforts. The mission itself is one part repetition of the gameplay so far, but does throw some interesting changes in the form of architecture. As while the stealth is something the player is more than likely very familiar with at this point, the house itself is impossible. This is not an exaggeration, as the level seems to defy reality itself, as the scale and even orientation of the rooms change, with some areas being a strange mix of mossy caverns and tiled corridors, despite you having seemingly climbed higher and higher in what from the outside looked like a relatively normal mansion. Having stolen the sword, you're taken to meet your client, who is revealed to be Constantine himself. He and Victoria describe to you how this mission was a test of your abilities, and as a reward, you can keep the magical sword you stole. A useful thing, as there is one aspect of the stealth system I've yet to describe. Your visibility is not only dependent on your stance and the amount of light in your current position, it's also affected by the weapon you currently have equipped. Having a sword out, for example, has you be more visible and also makes you slower than if you were wielding your blackjack. Things like fire arrows also make you significantly more visible than just having nothing in your hands. The magical sword you've just stolen doesn't make you move faster, but it does remove the visibility penalty from having the regular sword out. This isn't explicitly explained, but it is a very interesting feature. Constantine explains that he's a collector of rare items, many of which are not for sale. This is why he needs the help of not merely a thief, but an artist of their craft. He explains that his current desire is to acquire a jewel called the Eye, held deep within abandoned parts of the city. If you're able to bring him this object, you will be handsomely rewarded. Having bills to pay, Garrett accepts, and the next mission begins. The level is partially very linear, but still has plenty of what could be expected from a thief level when it comes to things like side passages and stealthier ways of passing through obstacles. There are also some instances of clever emergent gameplay which isn't directly explained as an option. For example, in one portion of the level, your path is blocked by a drawbridge, with the controls for said bridge on the other side of the moat. You can dive in and enter the underground passages, which will eventually lead you to the other side, or you can shoot an arrow into the controls of the bridge and bypass the swimming segment entirely. It's a thing the game doesn't explicitly explain as a possibility, but it's also very possible that due to the nature of the game, the player would at the very least try this option and find out that in fact it's possible to manipulate objects from afar. It's brilliant. The rest of the level is mostly about avoiding monsters, zombies, and other undead. As many of the undead are extremely resilient, and due to the limited amount of equipment you have, it's almost impossible to completely dispatch all of the undead creatures. The level also introduces a new monster-type creature, which acts similarly to other living humanoid enemies and can be knocked out. The difference between these enemies and humans is that due to their inhuman appearance and soundscapes, it's more difficult to gauge their alertness, which is an interesting challenge to add in an otherwise very standard enemy type. Eventually, you reach an old Hammerite cathedral, which is locked by a series of strange devices. Unsure of how to get in, you eventually find a window that's too small for you to squeeze through, but it does show you your target, as something strange happens.
Poor man. The keepers have sealed the door, and only they know how to open them.
Unsure of where this voice came from, you still decide to follow the instructions, as the massive payout from getting your hands on this floating stone is very appealing, and you go on a lookout for an old keeper grotto, where they may have left instructions on how to open the locked doors of the cathedral. This is also where an interesting feature of the updated game comes into play. To reach the final goal, you need to use a fire arrow to light a pair of torches, which then opens up a secret passage into the keeper library. However, it's very much possible that you have none, or have used up your fire arrows. For this reason, the developers added a new unkillable enemy into the gold version of the game, in the form of an elemental which looks like a burning man. Damaging one enough causes them to flee, and leave behind fire arrows, which can then be used to reach your objective. Obviously, it's still not a perfect means of ensuring the player will not get softlocked, but it's still better than having an even higher likelihood that the player is forced to restart the entire level just because they weren't aware of the need for this specific form of arrows. The Keeper Library reveals the means to open the cathedral door. It has been sealed with 4 elemental keys, and each of these keys has been hidden in a different area to ensure no one can release what has been trapped within the cathedral walls. As such, the next 4 levels revolve around you trying to get your hands on these keys. The first of which is another new level, and is closer to regular thievery again, as you infiltrate a keep of mages. What I find interesting about the level that it's split into 5 segments. There's a central tower, around which are 4 smaller towers, each of which is dedicated to one elemental power. Within these towers, you need to solve problems based on their elements, such as having to dive in water in the water tower, or avoid floors of lava and noisy metal gratings of the fire tower, and so on. One aspect where the game fails in this level is about teaching game mechanics. This is where the most obvious introduction to a new tool, the gas arrows, happens. In the location where you get one of these arrows, the player can experiment with it and find out that it works in a similar way to the water arrows and can be used to extinguish fires. With the exception that as a magical arrow, there is no arrow drop after you've shot one. Why I feel like there is a failure in educating the player about the feature is that you can also use gas arrows to knock out enemies, with some exceptions, such as people with masks. The problem lies in how the enemies you'll face in the tower where the arrow lies are wearing masks, and as such seem immune to the effects of the gas. This can lead to the players assuming that gas arrows are merely an easier-to-aim version of the water arrows, masking the full usefulness of the tool. The next level continues the trend of changing the dynamics, and instead of going against humans, you're mostly fighting monsters again. You're also introduced to a new type of enemy, a spherical fire elemental. At this point, despite there being several notes describing how to easily dispatch these enemies, it's also likely the player is accustomed enough with the gameplay to assume that water plus fire equals bad, and therefore intuitively come off with a way to defeat the elementals. The third elemental key level is the last of the new additions in the Gold Edition, and in my opinion is probably the best new level. It begins similarly to the previous one, where you enter ancient caverns, fight or stealth around monsters, and eventually reach the treasure in a trapped room. However, this happens relatively early on, and you find out someone has gotten to the treasure before you, changing the objective of the mission. The rest of the level is a rather standard thievery map through an opera house with guards and patrons, and is a great example of the kind of open level design which makes these games so enjoyable, with multiple pathways to take and many ways with which to approach problems. This level also introduces one of my favorite non-lethal tools of the game in the form of a gas mine, which is otherwise identical to the explosive mine, but without the risk of accidentally killing your target. The 4th elemental key level is also interesting in how it changes some aspects of the gameplay loop. The key is being held in a Hammerite compound, and Garrett decides to infiltrate the Order by posing as one of their acolytes. This gives the player free reign over most of the level, allowing them to wander around in full view of the Hammerite guards, as long as certain rules are followed, a list of which is easily found from the level. Obviously, any hostility towards the Hammerites or being seen in restricted areas will turn the guards against you. So this kind of a change in how the initial approach to stealth is handled is to me very interesting. Once in possession of the elemental keys, you return to the cathedral, where you finally unlock the doors and enter the haunted hallways of the formerly sacred place. Due to the relative scarcity of the equipment you've learned can completely destroy the undead, it's possible, in a dire situation, to figure out something the game did a bad job teaching, and in fact seemed to do its best to make sure you would learn it as late as possible or miss it completely. In addition to the zombies, there are other types of undead, such as Hammerite zombies armed with their signature hammers and ghosts. Trying to kill these with weapons such as the holy water arrows is resource intensive, and only some means such as the explosive mines seem to be a sure way to destroy these undead with as few resources spent as possible. However, they can also be killed with your sword, and in fact fall relatively easily to it with a fully powered swing from behind while they're still unaware of your presence. For the longest time, I honestly didn't even realize this was possible. The initial encounters with the undead clearly teach the player that the sword is useless against the undead. Yes, you can hit the zombies enough that they fall down, but merely to their dormant state, from which they will wake up if alerted again. During these encounters, you're also very unlikely to have holy water bottles or explosive at your disposal, so the sword is more than likely to be the first weapon of choice the player will attempt to use. Then the game teaches the player about holy water and explosives, leading to an obvious conclusion that this is how the undead are meant to be defeated. Why this is a negative thing is that the lack of special weapons can lead to a lot of frustration until the player figures out that most of the undead enemies can in fact be killed by regular means. And that frustration can lead to some levels being more negative as experiences as they would have been had the game taught the player better about the rules of the creatures. With this knowledge, the level itself is pretty fun, and there is a nice level of tension while exploring the corridors of the long-abandoned compound. Very early on, you get your hands on your goal, the Eye. But the disembodied voice which guided you towards the elemental keys also wants to have some fun with you, and has magically sealed the passageway out. This leads to a segment where you explore the rest of the ancient Hammerite compound and end up learning more about how the Order functions as you help a friendly spirit finally complete what was left undone in life, allowing him to rest in peace, giving you an alternate exit from the area. Once out of the cathedral, Garrett is finally able to bring the Eye to his clients and gain a massive payday to fund his retirement. Well, obviously not, and instead he's betrayed and bound in vines. Victoria and Constantine begin to morph into more grotesque versions of themselves. Well, one of them grotesque, and are revealed to be members of a faction called pagans, who are more nature-oriented, worshipping old gods, a polar opposite of the technology-focused Hammerites. Constantine acts as a conduit for an ancient god called the Trickster, who intends to use the Eye to open a portal between a realm called the Maw of Chaos, through which he intends to bring in his army and return the city to nature's will. But the Eye is not complete, and still needs another component to be fully operational. And reminiscent of Lucio Fulci, Garrett's eye is ripped from his skull and used to complete the Eye. Garrett is left shivering and bound, as he has now fulfilled his purpose. But thankfully, the Keepers have kept an eye on their prodigal son, appearing from the shadows to release Garrett, imploring him to carry on, as allowing the Trickster to complete his plan would throw the world into complete chaos, which the Keepers would very much like to prevent. From this point onwards, the levels are in a sense more linear and more objective focused, instead of being about freeform thievery. The first of the finale levels is about trying to survive and escape Constantine's hellish maze, which is filled with strange humanoid creatures acting as an introduction to the kinds of dangers the Trickster is about to release to the world. The level begins in a place which can be familiar if you thoroughly explored Constantine's mansion during your quest for the sword. Something that's immediately obvious is that there is no preparation screen, and you begin with practically nothing in your inventory. Having to explore strange underground caverns where some things completely break the known laws of physics, while also having to scrounge for resources, makes this escape sequence moderately tense, and to me, is a pretty fun level which culminates in the overgrown version of Constantine's mansion, where only some areas are still accessible. The second finale level is also partially a return to a previous level, as Garrett believes getting help of the Hammerites would be a good idea. After all, they are sworn enemies of the pagans and might have the means to prevent the trickster's plan from succeeding. As expected, getting their help is not that simple, since the trickster's minions have already assaulted the Hammerites, whose compound has been completely overrun, with the survivors having been forced into the caverns beneath the fortress. Helping the Hammerites rescue their leader from the minions of chaos gains enough of their trust that they create a booby-trapped replica of the Eye, which Garrett is tasked to exchange with a real one. Surmising that as the trickster is performing his hellish rituals to merge the dimensions, if the Eye were to be fake, perhaps whatever powers would be focused within the Eye would backfire and defeat the trickster instead. So you enter the Maw of Chaos, an area of impossible physics, and also yet another very linear level, where you can see the minions you've been fighting being created and sent into the city through the same portal which you used to enter this strange realm. Actual gameplay within the map brings practically nothing new to the formula, and is mostly a compilation of cool set pieces through which you venture as you're trying to reach your prey. The finale itself is not exactly a boss fight, even though that might be expected, as actually trying to fight the trickster is a very bad idea. Instead, you need to sneak into the middle of his magical circle before the trickster completes his ritual, and exchange the Eye with a fake one in your inventory. Once you've done so, and potentially waited for quite a while as the trickster slowly goes from one pillar to another, activating them one at a time, the plan succeeds, and the ritual backfires, killing what is essentially a god. Once more, Garrett is back in the city, having received a mechanical replacement eye from the Hammerites as a reward for defeating their mortal foe, intending to return to his profession as he is confronted by a keeper. The animosity between Garrett and the keepers has not vanished, and he is not particularly receptive towards this discussion. The keeper informs Garrett that everything has gone according to the keeper prophecies, and that he still has many friends in the ranks of the keepers, and how they have an important book that he should read, as a new danger is prophesied. And Garrett will once more need to rise to the task of stopping this threat. Angrily, Garrett explains that he has no interest in the keepers, and wants him to tell everyone that he wants to be left alone. But this doesn't concern the keeper at all, and instead,
I will tell them this. Nothing has changed. All is as it was written. The trickster is dead. Beware the dawn of the Metal Age.
Thief is absolutely amazing, and in my opinion, one of the best stealth games, even if it's not without its pretty obvious flaws. Being a trailblazer of sorts at the time of release, Thief does the sensible thing, and for the most part tries to teach the player how the game is meant to be played as much as possible. This begins with the technically skippable short tutorial going through the movement controls and game mechanics, which is a great way to get the player accustomed to the basics before putting them in the more sandbox-like missions of the main game. The missions themselves manage to teach the player with varying success. For example, the first level is pretty basic thievery in a somewhat open map with relatively few guards. This allows the player to experiment and learn everything taught in the tutorial in a relatively safe environment, while also being shown several new important game mechanics. And to me, the introductory mission is structured in a way that I would almost call nearly perfect, for the purpose of teaching a player how to play a genre they had never likely experienced before. Unfortunately, the second level is where the biggest flaw of the learning process happens, as the style of the game wildly changes with the introduction of the undead, and the lessons learned about the undead in the second mission are detrimental for later levels with different types of undead. However, once over the hump of the sudden change, the game begins to alternate between more standard thievery missions, where the player is tasked to avoid humans in environments familiar and recognizable to the player, such as mansions and fortresses, and missions where the more supernatural elements of the setting are in the forefront. After the first two missions, this alternating style isn't as grating, and I would wager a lot of people who enjoy Thief either don't mind it or actually like it, such as I. But there's no getting around how the supernatural was introduced so quickly with absolutely no warning that people who had justifiably assumed that the game would be more like the first level might be very off-put about this sudden change and begin to dislike the game as a result. I very much enjoy how the level design works, for the most part. A large portion of the levels give you a single main task, which you need to find and figure out how to complete. This is not all you need to do, and on the harder difficulties there are additional side objectives, and also a requirement to get a specific amount of loot from the level before you're allowed to continue. This means that exploration becomes an important aspect of the gameplay loop, since for the most part levels are relatively open, and you can explore most of the level on your own pace and in the order you decide to. There are also all kinds of hidden pathways, side passages and so on, which can lead to new places or have new ways of reaching your goal from a different angle. This is absolutely fantastic, and the freedom to approach the levels in the way the player wants to is one of the key features of Thief. To facilitate this freedom, there are plenty of different kinds of tools to cater to different kinds of playstyles or situations. Most of the tools usable from the inventory are more offensive, coming in the form of mines and a bomb. Obviously, these are not particularly quiet tools, but they can be very useful. The special arrows, on the other hand, have many varying uses, from things like facilitating stealth, when it comes to things like water arrows that can be used to create more darkness to skulk in, moss arrows used to make surfaces quiet, or gas arrows that can be used to knock out most enemies. There are also offensive arrows, such as your basic broadhead arrows, and fire arrows that explode on contact, dealing significant amounts of damage and also lighting any unlit torches in the explosion radius, something that's occasionally used as a puzzle element. Finally, one of the most interesting arrows is the reusable rope arrow that can be shot into wooden surfaces to create a climbable rope, allowing for some very creative exploration of areas. The tools are slowly introduced to the player either through environmental exploration or as tools that can be bought from the mission preparation screen. And more often than not, every new tool is given at a point where they will be almost immediately useful. The setting of Thief is fascinating. The centerpiece of it all is the city, a metropolis that's somewhat medieval, with sprinkles of a more steampunk-like aesthetic, depicted with a cut stone aesthetic mixed with metal features and strange machinery, apparently powering things like some streetlights and elevators. Not that much is known about the regular folk of the city, and their lives are basically meaningless to Garrett and to the plot. There seems to be some kind of a social hierarchy based on the class structure of a monarchy, but none of that really matters. What is important is a trio of societies. The most visible of these is the Hammerite Order, which seems to be the most powerful singular faction in the city. They zealously follow the teachings of their deity, the Builder, and these teachings seem to be about creation, order, and strict adherence to their hierarchy. While the city has its own police force of sorts, the Hammerites seem to mostly ignore them, serving their own brand of justice and having their own prisons as well. The second important order are the pagans, who abhor the city, as it's an unnatural feature where humanity has isolated itself from the ancient fears and struggles of their ancestors, who were subjected to the harshness of the natural order. They worship ancient gods and are the mortal enemies of the Hammerites, who have managed to drive away the pagans into hiding. The third are the Keepers, the least known of any of the groups, who remain in the shadows, observing, documenting, and seemingly trying to maintain some kind of a balance based on their prophecies. This is the order that trained Garrett, who left to chase his own profession instead. Thief focuses mostly on introducing the player to the Hammerites, and at the end touches more on the pagans, while the Keepers are still left mostly an enigma. Which I like, as that combined with the warnings at the end of the game leave a lot of room for future storytelling in the sequels. The mission introduction cutscenes act as small snippets of lore building for these factions as well, in the form of quotes from the writings of each of the factions, one of each being presented before Garrett's narrated mission description. Overall, the setting of Thief is very interesting to me, and there is a lot of lore that can be found by a player who's willing to explore everything thoroughly and read through various books scattered around the levels. The visuals of the game are not the most amazing, even for the time, but I feel like it would be wrong to call the game ugly. It's not the most beautiful game, but the art direction is pretty fantastic. Every faction and area has their own distinctive look, and it's pretty easy to get a feel of the place you're exploring. The art direction also makes it very easy for the player to identify different kinds of surfaces at a glance, which is an important part of the game, as different surfaces make different sounds, and also react to some of your arrows in different ways. All of this is important for successfully stealthing yourself around the levels, and the art team did an amazing job. What the game lacks in graphical fidelity and polygon count, the engine makes up for with lighting, which works really well in not only enhancing the atmosphere of the game, but as a dynamic and very important gameplay element. One negative aspect of the lighting is very much a result of the age in which the game was made, as there are occasional appearances of very annoying flashing lights that cannot be turned on or off, leading to some places potentially having issues for people with photosensitivity. The soundscape is also quite amazing. There is barely any music, and most of the sounds you hear are composed of different ambience that change depending on where you are, which works well to complement the art direction. Other than that, the soundscape is also central to the gameplay, as most noises you make can be heard by the enemies, making it important that the sounds are clear and distinctive. Learning what every surface sounds like can also be used as a tool by the player, as some areas have floors with alternating surfaces, such as tiled floors with carpets covering parts of the floor. Being able to not only hear these sounds, but also using the rather effective directional sound system of the game to your advantage, it's possible to use sound alone to accurately gauge where a guard is at that specific moment. It's absolutely fantastic. The sound propagation is very fascinating to me, as it seems to travel through the levels somewhat realistically. Doors and such block sound pretty effectively, but hallways and other level geometry seem to affect where they appear to come from. This is amazing, especially for the time when Thief was released. It shouldn't come as a surprise, but I love the gameplay loop of skulking in the shadows, looking for openings where I can get closer to my goal, while trying to outsmart the guards and remain unseen while clearing a path to my objective. This doesn't mean that the gameplay loop is perfect, as Thief shows its age with several aspects that can potentially ruin that loop for some people. For example, the AI is not particularly smart, despite having some surprisingly advanced features. One aspect where this is very apparent is in how the guards seem to have a very short memory. If someone finds a body, they will obviously be alerted. This is to be expected, and some characters will run and try to find a nearby guard to alert them, and some will merely begin to look around for the culprit. Eventually, though, they will abandon this pursuit and return to their regular duties, completely ignoring that their friend is dead. This means that it's very much possible, and sometimes even preferable, to just take out the guards one by one, even if you end up being seen, as you can just run away and return to the same position later, and the guards are back to their regular duties. Sometimes they seem to remain in a more alerted state, however, which is practically impossible to distinguish from their regular mode. Why this is a problem is that while alerted, it's harder to sneak up on them and also to knock them out, which can end up being very frustrating as the guard may seem to have superhuman senses. This also leads to another issue with the AI, which is the somewhat easily abusable combat mode. Many enemies tend to not be able to react to a player running around them or ferociously attacking them without pause, leaving them unable to actually fight back against the player. As you can also knock out enemies with a blackjack if you just pummel them enough, this can lead to some relatively funny moments. Level navigation is another aspect where Thief shows its age, and while moving around the map works pretty well for the most part, the physics engine sometimes gets strange with slopes and ledges. Where this becomes an issue is during levels which require platforming. The player can jump and grab ledges, but sometimes the ledge grab function seems to just not work, for whatever reason. Similar issue happens with jumping as well, and it's possible to jump on a relatively thin platform, feel like you've hit it perfectly, but the game instead decides that you hit the edge enough and slides you off the platform, causing you to fall. There are also moments where stairs or doorways seem to block your movement, leading to either the need to move faster or even to jump, which will obviously make more sound than the player might want to cause at that point. However, I don't consider these issues to be massive problems, but they are slight blemishes that people should be aware of. Overall, I love Thief, and to me, it's an amazing example of a stealth game. Obviously, that kind of a game is not for everyone, but if someone likes slow and methodical stealth games, Thief is absolutely something that should be given a try, especially with the T-Fix fan mod that can also be used to make the game a little bit prettier and have some additional quality of life features previously unavailable. Less than 2 years after Thief, the sequel was released. Starting the game immediately makes one thing very clear, as even the menus are almost identical to those in the first game, aside from some visual differences. Thief 2 was built on an updated version of the Dark Engine, on which Thief and also System Shock 2 were made. This means that much of the game feels very familiar to anyone who's played Thief, and the vast majority of gameplay is practically identical to that game as well. The story begins slightly over a year after the events of Thief, and Garrett is still working his preferred profession. The first mission has him help an associate called Basso, whom you could have rescued from the Crag's Cleft prison during the second mission of the first game. He is very much in love with an indentured servant of a noblewoman who refuses to let the woman out, as marriage would annul the service contract. Because of this, Basso wishes for Garrett to break into the manor and clear a way to the servant quarters, so he can then rescue her and live happily ever after together. This mission highlights several similarities and also some differences with the sequel. As mentioned before, the gameplay is almost identical to the first game, so everyone who's played that will immediately be in their element. For new players, however, Thief 2 doesn't do as good of a job of introducing the gameplay or the tools of your trade. I wouldn't say it does a terrible job either, but for someone unfamiliar with the series, the lack of a tutorial and how the game relies on the player learning far more in a shorter amount of time during the levels does make the first game a far better introduction to the series. The first level also introduces a somewhat common design element that persists in most of Thief 2's maps. You first begin the level by reaching the basement of the manor. Within this basement you can find the servants' quarters and enough loot to complete the secondary objectives even on hard mode. However, there is a whole manor above the basement, which you never have to enter if you don't want to explore for even more loot. This is a very common thing in Thief 2, and many maps have several areas which are basically completely irrelevant to your quest, and you will only ever find them if you specifically go out of your way to explore more than is required. In some ways, this is a good thing, as exploration is one of the best parts of Thief, but so many of the areas also feel very empty, and the vastness of the levels ends up having relatively little of note for you to find, which is not as good. Some of this is likely a result of a slightly different development cycle when compared to the first game. As in Thief 2, apparently the levels were made first, and the story was made to fit around the levels that were made, which would also account for most of them being very detailed and having a variety of options on how to approach different goals. Sometimes this works exceedingly well, but then there are levels such as the second level that is kind of a cool set piece depicting a large warehouse district, but this level is also one of the emptiest levels, where the main quest only requires you to enter a very small area of the level, leaving almost a half of it as something completely optional that you never ever need to access. One issue with the levels being larger has to do with loot. In Thief, most loot items were large and easily noticeable and also worth a decent amount of money, so you never had to collect a massive amount of objects to reach your loot objectives. In Thief 2, this isn't as much the case, as the economy of the shops has not changed, which has led to some of the more annoying design decisions of the sequel. The loot items in the levels are now worth much less than in Thief, and there are many more individual objects scattered around the levels. Since their value should be reflected by their in-game models, this means that sometimes a large amount of stealable loot will be small stacks of coins or rings on tables or floors. Making the loot items smaller to account for their decreased value makes sense, but it also makes looking for said loot more annoying than in the first game. And while I actually enjoy playing Thief on the hardest difficulty, in Thief 2 I don't enjoy that much, and usually every level ends up with a period of just looking through every nook and cranny to find those few extra coins to reach the increased loot requirement, so I just consider hard to be the optimal difficulty for myself. The early levels also introduce some new thievery tools, such as potions to make you fall slower or make you invisible for a moment, and also a scouting orb that takes advantage of your mechanical eye, allowing you to throw the orb somewhere and see through it while remaining safely in the darkness. Having some additional tools at your disposal is very much appreciated, but the best update to me is the ability to recover mines. In Thief, once you have thrown a mine, you cannot disarm it and pick it back up again. In Thief 2, this has been changed, and by carefully approaching a mine you can get close enough to disarm it with your lockpicks. This time the storyline of Thief 2 focuses even more on the Hammerites, or to be exact, a splinter faction called the Mechanists, who rise to power with a new leader after the Hammerites were severely weakened by their short war with the armies of the Trickster. This leader is called Cutis, who is seen as a sort of prophet by his followers and is also respected by many of the citizens, as unlike the Hammerites, the mechanists are more willing to use their technology to also help those who are not members of their order, and as such, new technologies are spreading. These technologies are slowly being introduced to the player as they heavily affect the way the player needs to approach certain situations. The first of these is the introduction of the Watchers, mechanical heads attached to the ceiling which do what the label implies: watch. In effect, they are steampunk security cameras which on their own work in an identical way to the security cameras in System Shock 2. As they first see you, they enter an alerted state, and a light in the Watchers turns yellow. This gives the player a short amount of time to hide before the Watcher enters alarm state. That triggers the alarm system attached to that specific Watcher, calling in any guards within the area. Unlike the System Shock 2 cameras, the Watchers are not easy to destroy, but they can often be shut down by exploring the level and finding their control panels. In the third level, the story slowly begins to ramp up, as Garrett is contacted by a mysterious stranger who hires him to break into the City Watch headquarters to frame a high official of thievery. As a set piece familiarizing the player more with the world, this level is absolutely fantastic. We've never really given a perspective into the daily goings-on of the general population, but exploring the City Watch headquarters gives us a closer view of this aspect of the world, and reading the notes found around the building gives us a view into the internal politics of the City Watch. And there's even an opportunity to eavesdrop on a conversation between a city guardsman and a noblewoman contacting them about a crime of sorts.
Excuse me, ma'am. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of your problem as quickly as I can. The sooner we're done here, the sooner we can start looking for your servant. Why don't you calm down and collect yourself while I go over what we have so far?
I'm sorry, officer. Thank you.
We also find out more about a new sheriff who has waged an effective campaign against the criminal underworld, putting many of the guilds out of business for good. This is also where the new technologies begin to have an increased presence, as there are even more watches, and the entrance to the building is protected by another new piece of equipment, a deadly turret, once more shaped like a head. Soon, however, the sheriff's eyes turn on Garrett, and the City Watch comes after him, leading to a mission taking place on the streets of the city, as you're avoiding the sheriff's forces trying to reach your hideout. To me, it's a bit of a shame that there's not that much content in this level, as this would have been the perfect point to give us much more information about the inhabitants of the city and their daily lives. But it's still interesting to see the areas where people actually live, even if most of the map relies on environmental storytelling. What comes after, however, is absolutely fantastic, as the Keepers contact Garrett once more, convincing him to come with them to hear an interpretation of a prophecy. This is a small but very interesting glimpse into the Keepers, and I absolutely love the way the player's knowledge about the factions is handled. We see an older woman reading from a book of magical glyphs, speaking in an unrecognizable language. Beside her is a young girl who seems to be interpreting these words and speaking them in English for everyone to understand. This doesn't particularly impress Garrett, who reiterates his desire to be left alone. Despite his obvious distaste for the Keepers, they still choose to help him, giving Garrett information that could help him in his current predicament, leading him towards a meeting that might shed more light on how to get the sheriff off his back. The next mission takes place in a mechanist outpost and once more introduces new gameplay features, this time in the form of what the mechanists call a Child of Cutis, a massive steampunk robot patrolling the outside perimeter. These robots are very imposing and can swiftly decimate an unprepared player with their turret. For those familiar with System Shock 2, however, the basic functionality of these robots might seem familiar. There are some changes though, and while the cheesy way to destroy robots remains, there is an interesting and very fun feature which makes the stealthy disabling of the robots possible. Even the robots are very much steampunk inspired, and as such, they are fueled by a continuously burning furnace that is fueled from a hatch located at the back of the robots. Shooting this hatch with water arrows will eventually douse the fire, completely disabling the robots that shut down with a somewhat sad voice line. The rest of the level is pretty interesting as well, and there are plenty of environmental storytelling, which is absolutely fantastic in Thief 2. One of these is pretty much perfectly linked to how the storyline progresses, as you eavesdrop on a meeting between Cutis and Sheriff Truett, who seem to be working together.
Behold, Sheriff Truett, from the lowly street rat emerges the loyal worker, that which I call the servant.
The sheriff has been supplying the mechanists with transients and criminals in exchange for promises of power and wealth. What the mechanists are doing with these people is also revealed, as Cutis shows off how he's turned one of these people into a submissive servant. Not only that, he shows off a feature the sheriff wasn't aware of, as the servant begins to exhale a red gas, which completely dissolves another person, and also the servant, leaving behind nothing but a pile of red dust. None of this is shown, however, and while the long discussion between the two people is an interesting one, everything the player sees while it's going on is a door, which is, obviously, not the most interesting thing. Eventually, the sheriff leaves, happy in the knowledge that these servants will not be around him, and Cutis also seems very pleased. Especially since he's recorded the entire conversation, which implicates the sheriff of a multitude of crimes, something he intends to use to ensure the sheriff's continued loyalty. Since this recording would be a useful thing to manipulate the sheriff, Garrett decides that the bank where the recording is to be sent should be his next target as well. Where does the environmental storytelling come into play with this part? Well, since we couldn't actually see the meeting, it's possible to encounter a servant in another part of the level, where one of them seems to be converting the corpses of the people sent by the sheriff into more servants. After raiding the bank, you decide to infiltrate a party the sheriff is holding, and blackmail him yourself to get him off your back. Here, a locking system that could have been encountered once before plays a large part, as the mechanists have created a system which uses a specifically crafted gear to complete a mechanism, without which the link doors remain sealed.
Metal Gear. It can't be.
Technically, this is no different from a regular lock when it comes to game mechanics, but it is an interesting way to show how the technology in the world is changing, and unsurprisingly, being first introduced in the homes of the rich and powerful. Unfortunately, your plan does not pay off, and someone has broken in and killed the sheriff, leaving behind a keyring with the emblem of the second in command at the City Watch. With this one clue, you decide to follow the lieutenant, as she leaves a posting at an unscheduled time while carrying a letter. In practice, this is just a basic stealth mission, and you merely need to follow her to her destination, read the letter, and find out where it finally ends up. As such, not much looting is likely to happen during this time, and you may notice that the level is exactly the same as during the escape sequence earlier in the game. The letter itself reveals that the City Watch lieutenant has been collaborating with the pagans, trying to work against Sheriff Truett and Cutis. It's not a bad mission, and pushes the story further, as the source is revealed to be the pagans, who have a secret portal within the graveyard they use to travel between their grove and the city. What this also introduces is a rarely used feature, which I kinda wish would be used in every mission, and as such, can come as a surprise and leave the player into a very bad situation. Once you enter the portal, the next mission begins, and you retain all of the loot and equipment you currently have. Obviously, jumping into a teleporter means you're not going into a shop to purchase more stuff, so this makes sense. But if playing the game for the first time, there's no clear telegraph that this is going to happen, nor is there a precedent for you retaining all of your current gear, so it's possible to use most of your equipment while chasing down the couriers and be left with basically nothing for the next level. It's not a bad feature. On the contrary, the negative part is that it's not expected and breaks the rules that have been taught to the player so far. The next level I actually like. It's a more linear map where you're still following the courier, but this time they're bloodstains, as they were attacked at the end of the previous level. You're also given more of a view into the society of the pagans, who come off as just evil people worshipping a destructive god in the first Thief. Thief 2, on the other hand, manages to make them more sympathetic, as some of the mechanists have found this grove, and ruthlessly massacred the inhabitants, whose ghosts and writings you're able to view.
You can have this. I don't need it anymore.
Come, Lily, must we go?
The pagan society just seems to be that of very regular people, just people who embrace nature over technology. They live and love just like everyone else, and run-of-the-mill pagan just wants to be left to their own devices while living in harmony with the nature. Eventually, you'll also enter the Maw of Chaos, which has significantly changed in appearance since the previous game, as have the creatures living within this domain, who now have a more primate appearance when compared to the more insectoid-like creatures fought during the reign of the Trickster. This change is explained as you reach the courier, who's died of their wounds, and you find an old acquaintance.
Garrett. Victoria.
Despite your history, you decide to work together to find out what Cutis' plans are and stop his taking over of the city, a goal beneficial to both Garrett and the pagans. This leads to one of the bigger maps of the game, where a part of it takes place on the rooftops of the city, as you're trying to reach the massive mechanist tower called Angel Watch, and find new holy texts of the mechanists and information about something called Project Cutis. The level acts as a nice view into the mechanist order, and also to Cutis' aversion to actually engage with people. He has invited many of the city's nobles to a celebration where he also gifts servants to these nobles, but has also decided to not actually be there himself, instead leaving recordings behind to address the guests, while not seeing any of them personally. One of these recordings has been left for you specifically, as he seems to have predicted your infiltration of Angel Watch, giving more of a reason to see this man as a threatening force with a large intellect. The next two levels follow Garrett's quest to capture a high-ranking mechanist, who might be able to reveal more information about Cutis' plans, and the one notable addition to the flow of the game is an enemy wearing a diving suit, who's immune to gas, and also to instant knockouts from your blackjack. These enemies aren't used much, leading them to be more of a curiosity rather than a serious new feature that changes the way the player has to approach situations. This pair of levels is also the second time you retain all of your equipment between the levels, and are unable to purchase more items, as you find a secret mechanist submarine and hitch a ride inside it to a dig site where this high-ranking mechanist resides. The second mission is kind of interesting, in how it's a revamped version of the Lost City from where you found the second elemental key in the first game, with plenty of changes, but also some recognizable areas. You still don't learn much about this precursor civilization, except that even the mechanists find their technology advanced. It's revealed that some of this technology is what Cutis is after, specifically some kinds of masks and something called the Cultivator. To figure out what these are, you decide to infiltrate a mansion of a collector who's intending to exhibit some of his valuable objects, some of which include a vast collection of masks, including those of the precursor civilization. This is also a part of the game that I dislike the most, as it's hard to not see it as egregious padding. During the first level, the exhibits have not yet been completed, and you're tasked to break in and explore the map for secret entrances, security stations, and so on. You're also forbidden from engaging with the guards, and attacking them or being seen immediately causes you to fail. Why this feels like padding is that the next level takes place in the same map, and the vast majority of it is just retreading the same hallways and corridors, just with less limitations and more guards. I feel like they should have just not had the first of these two levels and put the player directly into the version where you actually get to steal the objects you're after. To give some credit, at the very least during your second visit, you explore a floor which is technically not accessible due to the limitations of what you're allowed to do during your first visit, so there is something new for the second visit. Having the objects in your possession, Cutis' plans finally become clear. The masks act as a sort of mind-controlled device, creating slaves of the innocent victims of Cutis, who are then sent as servants to the houses of the nobles. These servants are also equipped with the cultivators, which seem to enhance chemical reactions and disperse what is inserted into them in a violent reaction. What this chemical is the red dust discovered relatively early on in the game, which is shown to result in a chain reaction which lasts as long as the dust can reach more biological matter that is then turned into more red dust. Having these deadly servants located in the few places with ample biological matter in the form of not only people, but also plants in the large gardens of the nobles, it becomes clear that if these servants are triggered to release their load, the entire city, and perhaps even everything surrounding it, would be destroyed, with all biological life wiped out from the face of the earth, while Cutis would be safe within the hermetically sealed Mechanist Chapel. For obvious reasons, this doesn't seem like an optimal outcome, so Garrett and Victoria both agree that Cutis must be stopped. once and for all, and Victoria comes up with a plan to attack the chapel, fill it with as much plant life as possible, while Garrett would find a device Karas uses to call the servants in for maintenance, sealing the servants in with Karas and containing the deadly reaction within the chapel walls. Garrett considers this plan to be bad, figuring it would only lead to their deaths, and storms off, promising to come up with something better, as Victoria declares there is no time. As Garrett is wandering the city, a friendly keeper confronts him, revealing that Victoria has attacked the Mechanist Chapel, causing Garrett to rush into the scene, in an unusual show of actual sympathy for someone else. Just like Garrett predicted, the assault does not end well for Victoria, and as her last act, she explodes into a mass of plant life, filling the entrance with ample biological matter, clearly affecting Garrett. The final level is rather long and filled with a massive amount of Karas' robots, making it unlikely that the player would be able to destroy them all, at least without some cheesy tactics. The first part revolves around figuring out how to build a guiding beacon, which would call the servants back into the chapel. This is an interesting aspect of the level, as you're led to collect specific materials from the storage rooms and then follow instructions on how to use the crafting machinery located around the level. Not only is this a requirement for the main quest of the level, but there are other recipes to be found, which can be used to create other useful items, such as mines to help you destroy some of those pesky robots. You're also shown how far Karas' disdain for humanity goes, in the form of an ominous diary entry of one of his loyal followers, who accidentally gave Karas a morbid idea. During the game, you've met many mechanists, but in this final level, there are none, as all of the loyal mechanists have been turned into mindless servants, similar to the transients Karas used previously. Once you've created the guiding beacon, the rest of the level has you explore the deeper parts of the chapel, modifying antennae to ignore Karas' command signals, the amount of which you need to modify depends on the difficulty level. As you're doing all of this, Karas periodically taunts you through the intercom systems.
Garrett, thou must prepare thy soul for the builder's arrival. Cleanse thy thoughts and accept his words. Embrace the coming of the builder's paradise and rejoice in the humble part that thou hast played.
Once finished, all of the servants are recalled without Karas' knowledge, and he finally seals the chapel, pleased with what is to come, reveling in the thought that soon the world will be free of all life, paving the way for the perfection of machinery. But that is not to be, and alas, you've saved the world once more. At the end, Garrett questions a keeper, while still being obviously angry about the death of Victoria, asking whether the prophecies of the keepers knew of all of this, to which he gains an affirmative answer, leading to a nice little cliffhanger.
And there's more.
Yes.
Tell me.
Just like Thief, Thief 2 is a great game with some blemishes. While most of the game is extremely similar to the first game, there are still obvious improvements and additions that are for the most part very much appreciated. The audiovisual capabilities of the engine have been improved, and while the games are not that different in overall graphical quality, the sequel still has some effects the first game didn't have, and the resolution and bit depth of the textures are clearly increased. The sound propagation system is improved but not entirely revamped, and things like doors aren't quite as good at muffling sounds anymore, allowing the player to listen to their surroundings better than before. Enemy AI, on the other hand, still has some of the same issues it had before, but there are some additions, such as the ability to somewhat react to doors opening and closing, even if for the most part this doesn't seem to result in much action from the AI other than exclamation acknowledging the event happened. Enemies are an aspect which does show a rather large difference in the design philosophies of the games, as there are very few undead enemies in Thief 2. The first game had several levels which focused almost exclusively on the unlife, whereas now there are only a few appearances of the undead, most of which are either hidden or completely optional. This is likely a response to the reaction people had to the undead portions of Thief, as most of the levels this time focus more on regular thievery around human enemies, and now also their technological creations. Even the enemies within the Maw of Chaos are now clearly more humanoid, making it even more clear to the player how to handle these encounters. In a similar vein, the more monstrous creatures of Thief make no appearances, and in fact we're even given an in-game explanation as to why.
Any luck on thy hunting, friend?
Nay, not a single beast.
Good riddance, then. Noxious things. 'Twill be a better world, more worthy of the Master Builder's work, when not a single stinking burrick remains to plague it.
Even though I didn't particularly find the undead and the monsters to be a bad thing, I also wouldn't say that I find this change in focus to be that bad either, and it's probably more in line to what people would expect from a game called Thief. As mentioned before, the level design is mostly pretty good, but with some flaws that stem from the increased size of the maps. While I was not a fan of the kind of loot scattering that makes the hardest level more annoying to play than in the first game, it is inarguable that overall, the level design in Thief 2 is much more detailed, and the levels really feel like places that could exist in this world and where people live and work. The one part of the levels that I really didn't like was the partial recycling. During the two city street levels, it's not as noticeable at first, but it's also impossible to unsee the recycling once you see it. That at least is not a bad way to reuse assets, but I can't get my head around why the latter level recycling was deemed a good idea, as going around literally the same map twice in a row with only somewhat minor changes is hard to not see as anything other than unnecessary padding. The levels also have more unique aspects to them, which are only encountered in a single level. Some of these include the creation machines and the final level, where the player can craft new equipment, or a level where you need to make an impression of a key and return the original to where you found it. Or color-coded security systems in the penultimate level that acts as a kinda sorta puzzle, letting you loot several exhibit rooms by matching the wall colors with the security system levels. I really like this, and having these kinds of unique features that are not repeated gives the levels more individuality. While there are some new pieces of equipment, most of it is practically inconsequential. Sure, a slow fall potion is sometimes useful, but very rarely. I also don't think I've ever found a situation where I thought a flash mine would be more useful than your standard flash bomb. Still, I don't mind having more equipment, even if some of it doesn't seem useful for my playstyle. The story itself is absolutely fascinating, and it starts to slowly build up from the second level onwards, as long as you keep listening to people and reading as many of the books you can find. This is a massive positive change when compared to Thief, where it felt like the main story just started suddenly and went places that weren't particularly well telegraphed. Here, the pieces to Cutis' plan were revealed little by little, and by the end all of their pieces fell together well. Even in the second level, you can already hear about the rift between the traditional Hammerites and the Mechanists, and it's possible to find a shut-down robot guardian in a Mechanist warehouse. Similarly, the red dust is revealed relatively early on, and the purpose behind it is made clear later on during the storyline when more pieces have been revealed. I also really like the character of Cutis, who is a kind of exaggerated caricature, someone who might be called a nerd, even talking in a stereotypical way, who's clearly been bullied and looked down on due to his nature, which has festered into a fully blown hatred for everything living. But he's also a devout believer, seeing himself as the hand of the Builder, someone through which his God works through, his mind corrupting the teachings of the Builder to something where his ideal world, devoid of all of the bullies and those who look down on him, is a world the Builder wants to see created. How the relationship of Garrett and Victoria changes during the game is also fantastic. It's not hard to see how after the first game the two separated as enemies, but the appearance of this more grave threat forced the two to form an uneasy alliance, which seemed to grow into something that actually got an emotional reaction out of the usually detached Garrett, even getting him to return to the Keepers at the end, something he's been very adamantly against. One of the fun parts about this duology are the recurring characters of the two bantering guards, who have had the misfortune of working in several locations that Garrett has decided to break into.
But I've been thinking we should watch the outside.
That's stupid. People to worry about there on the inside.
No, then you catch them before they get inside, you taffer.
Oh!
I don't know, and I don't care. We go through this all the time. You ask me stupid questions and then something goes wrong. Lord Bafford, Lord Donald, Sheriff Truitt, we worked for all of them and always gotten fired because someone broke in, something got stolen, or someone got killed.
Despite being very good, in many ways Thief 2 comes off more like an expansion pack than a completely separate game. One of the reasons why I say that is because the engine, while updated, is still mostly the same. And there are barely any changes to the mechanics or the functionality of the game. They are just polished iterations of the first game. The lack of a proper tutorial is another reason, as it's clear the game expects the player to already be familiar with the game mechanics, and there is not a similar progression of base mechanics as there was in the first game that acted as a very good introduction to all of the features, little by little, getting the player more familiar with all of the tools and features at their disposal. Thief 2, on the other hand, still follows this style, but for the added features and creatures, slowly introducing mechanist creations by showing the player an easily avoidable version of a creation and then slowly ramping up the amount and difficulty of these encounters. It's a very good way to teach the player, but not doing the same for the basic features does mean jumping directly into Thief 2 might be a bit too overwhelming for many players. Overall though, Thief 2 is undoubtedly an upgrade, and while I find the hardest difficulty to be more tedious than difficult, most of the updates to the formula work very well, and the vast majority of the levels are interesting and give the player many ways to approach them. Thief 2 is definitely worth playing for anyone who likes stealth games, but preferably after playing the first game. Not only to be aware of the overarching plot of the franchise, but also because Thief is a much better game when it comes to teaching the player how to actually play, and of all of the options available to them. Well, this one took a while. Mostly because at the first time I thought it necessary to handle 2 games at once, for reasons I hope I've made obvious so far. Had I split this into 2 videos, I feel like I would have had even more repetition to keep both videos as something that can be viewed without seeing the other one, and I wanted to try and avoid it this time, hopefully with decent results. Next one should be an easier one, as the Thief series goes into a new generation. But that's the story for the next video. I would also like to thank all of the Patreon and Ko-fi supporters: Daniel Heinevetter, High Food Court, Iliad Drone, Paul Leone, The Bloke, Daniel Zupka, Kyriakos, R. Theron, Zai, Andrew Yanka, Isaac Gross, Masaz, and Professor Fessa. Thank you, everyone, for your support and patience. I've been enjoying this project a lot, and it's very much an honor to have so many people deem what I do worth their time. Hopefully, I'll be able to do this for a long time to come, and all of you helping me do that is extremely appreciated. Next time we'll see our Thief game on a new generation of consoles and computers is, and whether it's a good successor to the original 2 games, despite having changed hands due to the bankruptcy of the original studio. But that's next time. Until then, Fintrovert, signing out.